She owed a debt to the Alpha King's pack. She paid it by carrying him out of the burning hall. The arrow struck the tree an inch from Mira Voss's head before she even heard the bowstring snap. She froze, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, and slowly raised both hands into the cold night air. Around her, the forest had gone silent. No wind, no birds, only the soft crunch of boots closing in from every direction. "Don't move again," a voice called out. It was steady, sharp, used to being obeyed. Mira turned her head just enough to see them stepping out of the shadows. 6 warriors, broad-shouldered and silent, their eyes glowing faintly gold in the dark, the unmistakable mark of shifters. She had crossed into wolf territory without meaning to, chasing a stream that she thought would lead her to the next town. Instead, it had led her straight into the heart of danger. "I didn't know this was Packland," she said quickly, keeping her hands raised. "I was only passing through." "Nobody passes through the Alpha King's territory without paying for it," said the warrior who had shot the arrow. He lowered his bow but kept it ready. His eyes studied her the way a hawk studies a mouse. "You'll come with us." There was no room to argue. 2 of the warriors stepped forward and gripped her arms, pulling her along a narrow trail she hadn't even seen. Mira's mind raced. She had heard stories about the Alpha King's pack, whispered in taverns by travelers who never seemed to agree on the details. Some said he was fair, others said he was ruthless to anyone who crossed his borders. She was about to find out which stories were true. The trail opened into a wide clearing, and Mira's breath caught again, this time not from fear, but from awe. A massive hall stood at the center of the clearing, built from dark timber and stone, its windows glowing with warm firelight. Around it stretched a small village of wooden houses, smoke curling from chimneys, the distant sound of laughter and conversation drifting through the night. It didn't look like the lair of a monster. It looked like a home. But homes could still have teeth. They marched her straight to the hall, through heavy doors that creaked open, to reveal a long room filled with long tables, a roaring fire pit at its center, and dozens of pack members who stopped talking the moment she entered. All eyes turned to her. Mira lifted her chin, refusing to let them see how fast her heart was pounding. "An intruder, my lord," the lead warrior announced, pushing her forward. "Found near the eastern stream, past the boundary stones." At the far end of the hall, seated in a chair, carved from dark wood, sat a man Mira knew instantly had to be the Alpha King. He wasn't wearing a crown, he didn't need one. Everything about him, the way he sat, the way the room seemed to bend slightly toward him, the quiet weight in his eyes, told her exactly who held power here. He rose slowly, studying her from across the room. "Name," he said simply. "Mira Voss," she answered, keeping her voice steady, even though her knees wanted to shake. "And what business did Mira Voss have crossing into my land uninvited?" "None," she said honestly. "I didn't know the boundary was there. I was traveling. I lost my way." A murmur passed through the hall. Someone near the fire scoffed. Mira didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on the king, because in that moment, he was the only person in the room whose judgment actually mattered. He walked toward her slowly, his footsteps unhurried, and stopped only a few feet away. Up close, he was even more unsettling. Tall, composed, his gaze so direct it felt like being studied by something far older than his years suggested. "Do you know what happens to those who trespass on Packland?" he asked. Mira swallowed. "I imagine nothing good." A flicker of something, not quite amusement, crossed his face, before disappearing again. "Some would say you should be sent away and never allowed to return. Others in this hall." He glanced briefly toward an older man standing near the fire pit. "Believe trespassers should answer for the danger they bring to our borders." "I brought no danger," Mira said. "I was alone. I still am." "That is not for you to decide," the older man cut in, stepping forward. His eyes were sharp, distrustful. "My lord, we cannot simply release her. If word spreads that our borders can be crossed without consequence." "I am aware, Edmund," the king said calmly, without taking his eyes off Mira. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it was likely only seconds. Finally, he spoke again. "You will not be harmed. But you will not walk away freely either. You crossed into land that is not yours, and something is owed for that." He tilted his head slightly. "You will serve this pack for 1 year. In that time, you will earn your freedom through your labor. When the year is finished, you may leave, and the debt will be settled. Mira's stomach twisted. A year. An entire year bound to a pack of strangers, living among wolves who clearly did not trust her, working off a debt for a mistake she hadn't even meant to make. But she also understood, with a cold clarity, that this offer was far better than the alternatives whispered around her. "And if I refuse?" she asked, more out of instinct than any real intention to argue. The king's expression didn't change, but something in his voice sharpened just slightly. "Then you will discover exactly how unwelcoming this pack can be to those who reject its mercy." She held his gaze a moment longer, searching for any hint of cruelty behind the calm, and found none, only a quiet, immovable certainty that his word was final. She thought of the empty road behind her, the towns that had turned her away before, the coins she didn't have, and the family she no longer had either. A year of hard work suddenly didn't sound so impossible. "Fine," she said, "I accept." A ripple of surprise moved through the hall, as if no one had expected her to agree so easily. The king studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Edmund will see that you're given a place to sleep and work to do come morning," he said, turning back toward his chair. "You'll answer to him, and you'll follow the rules of this pack while you remain here. Cross me again, and there will be no second offer." "Understood," Mira said quietly. As the guards led her out of the hall and toward a smaller building near the edge of the village, she allowed herself one glance back. The king had already returned to his seat, speaking quietly with Edmund, his attention seemingly moved on from her entirely. And yet, just before the doors closed behind her, she caught him looking her way one final time. Brief, unreadable, gone, before she could make sense of it. The room she was given was small but clean, a single bed against the wall, a narrow window overlooking the dark tree line beyond the village. Mira sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long breath, the tension of the night finally draining from her shoulders. A year, she thought. A year of labor, surrounded by wolves who had every reason to distrust her, in the home of a king whose calm was somehow more unsettling than any anger could have been. She didn't know yet how much that year would change everything she thought she understood about debts, about danger, and about the strange, quiet weight of loyalty. She didn't know that the man on the carved wooden chair would one day owe his very life to her hands. She only knew, as she lay down and closed her eyes that first night, that she had survived one test, and that many more were waiting for her at first light. Outside her window, the fires of the village slowly dimmed one by one, until only the great hall still glowed in the darkness, a steady light standing watch over everyone within its walls. Mira fell asleep to the distant sound of wind moving through the trees, unaware that somewhere across the village, the Alpha King sat awake long after the hall had emptied, turning over in his mind the strange calm of a stranger who had looked him in the eye without flinching. It was a small thing, a single moment of quiet defiance in a hall full of tension, but small things, in time, have a way of becoming the foundation for everything that follows. Morning came quickly. Mira woke to the sound of voices outside her window, the village already stirring with early activity, the clang of tools, the low murmur of conversation, the distant bark of orders being given. She sat up, momentarily forgetting where she was, before the memory of the previous night settled back over her like a heavy blanket. A year. She had a year to survive here. She dressed in the simple clothes that had been left folded at the foot of her bed, and stepped outside to find Edmund waiting for her, his expression as unreadable as it had been the night before. "You're awake earlier than I expected," he said, studying her, the way one might study an unfamiliar animal. "I didn't want to start my first day by being late," Mira replied. Something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across his face before he turned and began walking. "Follow me. You'll be shown your duties, and you'll be expected to complete them without complaint. This pact does not tolerate laziness, and it does not tolerate excuses." "I don't plan on giving you either," Mira said, falling into step beside him. As they walked through the village, she felt the eyes of pack members following her every step, some curious, some openly hostile. She kept her chin lifted and her pace steady, refusing to let their stares shake her resolve. Whatever this year held for her, she would not spend it cowering. She had no way of knowing that, high above the village on the balcony of the great hall, the Alpha King stood watching her cross the square, his arms folded, his expression unreadable, already sensing that the stranger he had spared the night before was not going to be as easy to ignore as he had hoped. 3 weeks passed, and Mira Voss had learned the rhythm of the pack, the way a new player learns the rules of a game she never asked to join. Her days began before sunrise, hauling water from the stream, tending the fires in the great hall, scrubbing floors that never seemed to stay clean, and carrying supplies from one end of the village to the other, under the watchful, judging eyes of pack members, who still saw her as an outsider. Some ignored her completely. Others made their distrust known with sharp words or cold silence. Only a few, like a young pack member named Grace who worked in the kitchens, ever bothered to speak to her with any kindness at all. "You're stronger than you look," Grace said one morning, watching Mira lift a heavy crate of firewood without complaint. "Most people who come through that door don't last a week before they're begging to leave." "I don't have anywhere else to go," Mira admitted, setting the crate down by the hearth. "Might as well make the most of it." Grace studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "That's probably why you're still here. The pack respects effort, even when it doesn't trust the person making it." Mira thought about that as she went about her work that day, wiping down the long tables in the great hall, while the fire crackled softly in the pit nearby. It was strange, she realized, how quickly a place could start to feel less like a prison and more like simply a life. A hard one, but a life nonetheless. It was during these quiet moments in the hall, usually in the late afternoon, when most of the pack was elsewhere, that she first began to notice the Alpha King more closely. He was rarely in the hall during the day, often out with his warriors patrolling the borders or meeting with pack elders in private chambers she was never permitted to enter. But sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit near the fire alone, a cup of something warm in his hands, his eyes fixed on the flames, as if searching for answers hidden somewhere in the embers. He never spoke to her during those moments, and she never dared to speak to him first, but she noticed things, the way his shoulders carried a weight that never seemed to lift, even when he wasn't doing anything at all. The way pack members greeted him with respect that bordered on fear, yet none of them ever seemed to see the tiredness behind his eyes. The way he ate alone, even in a hall full of people who called him their king. "He is lonely," she thought one evening, watching him from across the room as she folded cloths near the hearth. It was an odd thought to have about a man who held so much power, but the more she watched him, the more certain she became. She wasn't the only one paying attention. Edmund, who oversaw her work and reported her progress each week, seemed to notice her glances more than once. "You'd do well to keep your eyes on your work, and not on the Alpha," he warned her one afternoon, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had seen careless mistakes cost people dearly before. "He is not a man to be studied like some curiosity." "I wasn't studying him," Mira said, though the denial felt weaker than she intended. "I was only noticing that he looks tired." Edmund's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. The weight of leading a pack this size does not disappear simply because a king wishes it would. There are enemies beyond our borders who would like nothing more than to see him fail. He carries that burden every day, whether the pack sees it or not. "Enemies?" Mira asked, curiosity sparking despite herself. Edmund's jaw tightened, as if he regretted saying as much as he already had. "That is not something you need concern yourself with. Focus on your duties." He walked away, before she could ask anything further, leaving her with more questions than answers. Enemies. The word lingered in her mind for the rest of the day, mixing with the quiet image of the king sitting alone by the fire, his gaze distant and heavy. That evening, as she carried a tray of empty cups back toward the kitchen, she passed close enough to his table to catch a low, tired sigh escape him, the kind of sound a person makes only when they believe no one else is listening. She hesitated, then, against every instinct telling her to keep walking, she spoke. "You look like someone who hasn't slept properly in a long time." The words left her mouth before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted the boldness of it. The king's head turned toward her slowly, his golden eyes catching the firelight in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her the way he had the night she first arrived, as if trying to understand something about her that even she didn't fully understand herself. "You have a habit of speaking without permission," he finally said, though there was no real anger in his voice. "I've been told that before," Mira admitted, setting the tray down carefully. "I can go, if you'd prefer the silence." He studied her a moment longer, then, to her surprise, gestured toward the empty seat across from him. Sit. Mira blinked, caught off guard. Around them, a few pack members glanced over, clearly noticing the unusual invitation, but the king paid them no attention. Slowly, cautiously, Mira lowered herself into the seat across from him. You've been here 3 weeks, he said, studying the fire rather than her. And yet you haven't complained once. Not to Edmund, not to anyone in this pack, as far as I've heard. Would complaining change anything? Mira asked. No, he admitted. But most people complain anyway. I've learned that complaining rarely fixes what's actually broken, Mira said quietly. It just makes the waiting feel longer. Something shifted in his expression then. Subtle but noticeable. A flicker of genuine interest breaking through the careful control he seemed to wear like armor. That's a strange kind of wisdom for someone your age. I've had a strange kind of life, Mira replied simply. He didn't press further, and she didn't offer more. They sat in a silence that, for the first time since she'd arrived, didn't feel heavy or uncomfortable. It felt, strangely, like two tired people, simply existing in the same space, without needing to explain themselves to each other. You may return to your duties, he finally said, though his tone had lost some of its earlier sharpness. Thank you for the tray. Mira rose, offering a small nod, before turning to leave. She had only taken a few steps when his voice stopped her. Mira. She turned back, surprised he even remembered her name. Edmund tells me you work harder than most pack members born into this territory, he said. That is not something I say lightly, nor something I forget. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded once more and continued on her way, her heart beating a little faster than she wanted to admit. Over the following days, small moments like that one began to repeat themselves. A brief exchange near the fire, a nod across the courtyard, a question about her day that seemed to come from genuine curiosity rather than obligation. Mira told herself it meant nothing, that the king was simply a man observing the newest addition to his pack, nothing more. But late at night, lying awake in her small room, she found herself thinking about the weight in his eyes, the tiredness he carried so quietly, and the strange, unexpected comfort of sitting across from him in the firelight. She told herself it was only curiosity. She did not yet understand that curiosity, given enough time and enough shared silence, has a way of quietly becoming something far more dangerous, and far more difficult to walk away from. The training yard was already crowded by the time Mira arrived that morning, carrying a basket of clean cloths, meant for the warriors who trained there every day before sunrise. She had grown used to the sight of them sparring, the sharp movements, the sound of wood striking wood, the occasional shout of encouragement or correction from whoever was overseeing the session. What she hadn't grown used to was being noticed by them. "Look who it is," a voice called out, and Mira turned to see a broad-shouldered pack member named Gareth, stepping away from the sparring circle, sweat glistening on his forehead, a smirk already forming on his face. The trespasser, come to watch real warriors train. "I'm here to deliver cloths, nothing more," Mira said evenly, setting the basket down near the edge of the yard. "Is that so?" Gareth circled closer, his tone carrying an edge that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. "Funny. Because it seems like you've been finding a lot of reasons to be near places you don't belong lately. First the border, now here, maybe even near the Alpha's table, from what I hear." A few of the other warriors chuckled, and Mira felt her face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. She kept her expression steady, refusing to give him the reaction he was clearly hoping for. "I go where my duties send me," she said, nothing more. Gareth stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "You think because the Alpha spoke to you once, you're something special now? You're still an outsider, a debt to be paid off, nothing more. Don't forget that." "I haven't forgotten anything," Mira said, her voice sharper now. "Have you?" Something flickered dangerously in Gareth's eyes, and before Mira fully understood what was happening, his hand shot out, gripping her arm hard enough to make her gasp. "Watch your tone with me. Let go of her." The voice cut through the yard like a blade, silencing every conversation, every clash of practice weapons, every breath. Mira didn't need to turn to know who had spoken. She felt Gareth's grip loosen instantly, his entire posture shifting from aggression to something close to fear as the Alpha King strode into the training yard, his expression colder than Mira had ever seen it. "My lord, I was only," Gareth began. "I saw exactly what you were doing," the king said, stopping just a few feet away, his golden eyes fixed on Gareth with an intensity that made even Mira take an involuntary step back. "You will not lay a hand on anyone in this pack without cause, least of all someone under my protection." The words hung in the air, and Mira felt her heart skip at the phrase, "under my protection." She hadn't realized, until that moment, just how much weight those words carried in a pack like this. Gareth's jaw tightened, but he lowered his head in a stiff bow. "Understood, my lord. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't." The king's gaze swept briefly over the rest of the gathered warriors, a silent warning that needed no further explanation. Slowly, the training yard began to move again, weapons resuming their rhythm, though the tension in the air remained thick. The king turned to Mira, his expression softening only slightly. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, rubbing her arm where Gareth's grip had left a faint mark. "I'm fine." "You don't need to protect his pride by pretending otherwise," the king said, studying her carefully. "If he hurt you." "He didn't," Mira interrupted gently. "Startled me, maybe. Nothing more." The king studied her a moment longer, as if trying to decide whether to believe her, before finally giving a small nod. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request, though it also wasn't spoken with the same commanding tone he'd used with Gareth. Mira fell into step beside him as they left the training yard, the eyes of every warrior present following their path until they disappeared around the corner of the hall. They walked in silence for a while, following a narrow path that led toward the edge of the village, where the trees grew thicker and the sounds of pack life grew quieter behind them. "You shouldn't have to face that kind of treatment," the king finally said, his voice carrying a rare note of frustration. "Not for a debt that was never truly a crime to begin with." "Most of the pack still sees me as an intruder," Mira said honestly. "I understand why. I would probably feel the same, if our positions were reversed." "That doesn't make it acceptable," he said firmly. "There's a difference between wariness and cruelty. Gareth crossed that line today, and he won't be the last to test it if I don't make my expectations clear." Mira glanced at him, studying the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes even now, when his anger had mostly settled. "Why does it matter so much to you? I'm still just someone paying off a debt, in the eyes of most of your pack." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Mira wondered if she had overstepped by asking. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more thoughtful than she had heard it before. "Because you've shown more integrity in 3 weeks than some pack members show in a lifetime," he said. "You didn't have to warn me the other night about the loose fencing near the eastern stables. You didn't have to stay late helping Grace prepare food for the elders' meeting when it wasn't part of your duties. You do these things without being asked, without expecting anything in return. That says something about a person's character." Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to being seen so clearly by someone who, by all rights, should have had no reason to notice her at all. "I didn't realize anyone was paying attention to those things." "I notice more than people realize," he said, a faint, almost rueful smile touching his lips, for the first time since she'd known him. "It comes with the position. Trust is not something I give easily, given everything resting on my choices, but it is something I recognize when I see it earned." They had reached the edge of a small clearing overlooking the valley beyond the village, the late afternoon sun casting long golden light across the treetops. Mira found herself momentarily breathless, not from the view, though it was beautiful, but from the quiet weight of standing beside a man who suddenly felt less like an unreachable king, and more like someone genuinely trying to understand her. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "You may." "Edmund mentioned enemies, the other day. Threats beyond the border." She hesitated, unsure if she was overstepping again. "Is that why you carry so much weight, even when you're simply sitting by the fire?" His expression shifted, the warmth from moments before retreating slightly behind a more guarded look. "That is not something I discuss freely, even with those I trust." "I understand," Mira said quickly, not wanting to push him somewhere he clearly didn't want to go. "I only ask because I've seen how tired you look, even when you think no one is watching. I wanted to understand why." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. There are those who believe I am not fit to lead this pack, those who left long ago under difficult circumstances, and who have not forgiven the choices that led to their departure. It is a complicated history, one I hope does not resurface in a way that endangers the people I've sworn to protect. Mira absorbed his words carefully, sensing there was far more beneath the surface of what he'd shared, but she didn't push further. Instead, she simply said, "Whatever history you carry, I don't think it changes what I've seen since I arrived. A king who protects his people, even the ones who trespass on his land by accident." Something in his expression softened again, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "You have a way of making complicated things sound simple. Maybe some things are simpler than we make them out to be," Mira said. They stood together in comfortable silence, as the sun continued its slow descent, and for the first time since arriving in this territory, Mira felt something she hadn't expected to feel at all. A quiet, cautious sense of belonging, standing beside a king who, despite everything, seemed to see her not as a debt to be repaid, but as a person worth knowing. Neither of them spoke of what that meant. Neither of them were ready to. But as they finally turned to walk back toward the village, the space between them felt just slightly smaller than it had before, and neither one seemed particularly eager to close it back up again. Word travels fast in a pack this size, and by the following week, the story of the training yard had grown in the retelling, until it barely resembled what had actually happened. "They're saying the Alpha nearly challenged Gareth for touching you," Grace whispered one morning, kneading dough in the kitchen while Mira scrubbed pots nearby. "Some are saying you used some kind of trick to get his attention. Others think you're a spy, sent to weaken him from the inside." Mira nearly dropped the pot she was holding. "A spy? That's ridiculous." "I know that," Grace said quickly, "but fear makes people believe strange things, especially in a pack that's already on edge." "Why would this pack be on edge?" Mira asked, remembering Edmund's warning weeks earlier about enemies beyond the border. Grace hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen doorway as if checking for anyone listening, before lowering her voice further. "There are old rumors about a rival faction, led by someone who used to be part of this pack a long time ago. Someone who left under bad circumstances and has been building power somewhere beyond our territory ever since. Most of us don't talk about it because the Alpha doesn't like it discussed, but everyone knows something isn't right. Extra patrols, longer meetings with the elders. It's been building for months." Mira absorbed this information carefully, pieces slowly beginning to connect in her mind. The king's constant tiredness, the guarded way Edmund spoke about threats beyond the border, the tension she often felt lingering beneath the surface of pack life, even during its quieter moments. "And now people think I'm somehow connected to that?" she asked. "Some do," Grace admitted. "It doesn't help that you showed up around the same time patrols started increasing. Bad timing mostly. But bad timing is enough to make people suspicious." The rumors followed Mira through the rest of the day, whispered glances trailing her as she moved through the village completing her duties. By the time evening arrived, she found herself dreading the walk back to the Great Hall, unsure what kind of reception awaited her there. She didn't have to wait long to find out. "A word, if you don't mind." Edmund's voice stopped her just outside the hall's entrance, his expression more serious than she had seen it since her very first night in the pack. He gestured for her to follow him into a smaller side room, away from the main hall's activity, and closed the door behind them once they were both inside. "You've heard the rumors," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I have," Mira admitted. "They're not true." "I believe you," Edmund said, surprising her. "But belief and proof are different things, and there are members of this council who require proof before they'll set aside their suspicions. What kind of proof could I possibly offer?" Mira asked, frustration creeping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. "I arrived here by accident, chasing a stream I thought would lead somewhere else entirely. I have no connection to whatever threat this pack is facing." "I know that," Edmund said, his tone softening slightly. "But the Alpha's growing attention toward you has not gone unnoticed, and in times like these, that attention makes you a target for suspicion, whether you deserve it or not." Mira felt her stomach tighten. "Is that why you're speaking with me now? Because of him?" Edmund studied her for a long moment before answering. "I have served this pack for many years. I watched the Alpha's father lead before him, and I have watched Kale carry burdens no one his age should have to carry alone. I am not blind to the way his guard lowers around you, nor am I blind to what that could mean, for better or worse. I haven't asked for his attention, Mira said honestly. I haven't tried to gain anything from this pack beyond finishing my debt and moving on with my life. Perhaps not, Edmund said, but intentions matter less than perception, especially now. I would advise caution, for both your sake and his. The council is already searching for reasons to distrust you. Do not give them one. Mira nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind his warning, even if she resented the situation that made it necessary. I'll be careful. See that you are, Edmund said, though his tone had lost most of its earlier sharpness. He studied her for a moment longer before adding, almost reluctantly, for what it's worth, I have not seen him this at ease around anyone in a long time. Whatever concerns the council may have, I do not believe you intend him harm. I don't, Mira said firmly. Then prove it through your actions, as you already have been, Edmund said. That is the only proof that will matter, in time. He left her alone in the small room after that, and Mira sat for a long while in the quiet, turning his words over in her mind. She thought of the council members who eyed her with suspicion, the warriors who whispered rumors about spies and rival factions, the growing weight of a threat she still didn't fully understand. And she thought of the king, sitting by the fire each evening, carrying burdens no one else in the pack seemed to fully see. Whatever was coming, whatever danger lingered beyond the borders of this territory, she realized she no longer wanted to simply wait out her debt and leave without ever understanding what he was truly facing. She wanted to help him carry it, even if she didn't yet know how. That decision, made quietly in an empty side room as the fire crackled beyond the door, would prove to be one of the most important choices of her life, though she had no way of knowing that yet. She only knew, as she finally rose and made her way back to her small room for the night, that something inside her had shifted. She was no longer simply counting down the days until her debt was paid. She was starting to care about what happened to this pack, and to the king who led it, far more than she had ever intended to. The council chamber was quiet when Mira found the courage to approach it that night, candlelight flickering beneath the door, low voices murmuring on the other side. She had never been permitted inside before, and she knew that entering uninvited would only fuel the very suspicions Edmund had warned her about. But something about the urgency pressing against her chest told her that waiting for permission might already be too late. She had spent the past 2 days delivering supplies to the storage house near the northern edge of the village, a task that placed her closer to the border patrols than she had ever been before. It was there, hidden behind stacked crates while waiting out a sudden rainstorm, that she had overheard 2 travelers speaking in hushed, urgent tones just beyond the tree line. Men who did not belong to this pack, their scent unfamiliar, their words careful and deliberate. They had spoken of a name that made her blood run cold. Simon. A name Grace had mentioned only in passing, tied to the old rumors of a rival faction, and a betrayed former beta who had left the pack years ago. The travelers had spoken of a plan, something involving a night when the pack's guard would be lowered, when celebration would make the Great Hall vulnerable, in ways it never was on ordinary days. She hadn't been able to hear all of it. The rain had grown too loud, and the travelers had moved on before she could gather more details. But what she had heard was enough to send a cold, sick feeling through her chest, one that hadn't faded in the 2 days since. Now, standing outside the council chamber, she understood she had 2 choices. She could stay silent, protect herself from suspicion, and let whatever was coming unfold without her involvement. Or she could risk everything, her fragile place in this pack, the trust she had slowly begun to build, even her own safety, by speaking up. She thought of Kale sitting alone by the fire each night, carrying burdens the pack couldn't see. She thought of the warmth in his eyes during their quiet conversations, the rare moments where the weight on his shoulders seemed to ease, even briefly. She could not, in good conscience, stay silent and let that weight crush him without warning. She knocked before she could talk herself out of it. The voices inside stopped immediately. A moment later, the door opened, revealing Edmund's surprised face. Mira? What are you doing here? This chamber is for council business only. I need to speak with the Alpha, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. It's urgent. Edmund hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the seriousness in her expression. Before he could respond, Cale's voice came from within the chamber. "Let her in, Edmund." Edmund stepped aside, and Mira entered a room she had never seen before. A long table surrounded by pack elders, maps spread across its surface, candlelight casting long shadows against the stone walls. Every eye in the room turned toward her, some curious, others openly suspicious. Cale rose from his seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp with concern. "What's happened?" Mira took a steadying breath. "I overheard something 2 days ago, near the northern storage house. I wasn't sure it was important enough to interrupt your work until I couldn't stop thinking about it." "Tell us," Cale said, his voice quiet, but commanding the full attention of everyone in the room. She recounted everything she had heard, the unfamiliar travelers, the hushed urgency in their voices, the name Simon spoken with a kind of dark reverence, the mention of a night when the pack's celebration would leave the great hall exposed. As she spoke, she watched the color drain slightly from several council members' faces, watched Edmund's jaw tighten, watched Cale's expression grow more still and controlled with every word, the way a man's expression grows still right before a storm breaks loose. When she finished, silence hung heavy over the chamber. "Simon," one of the older council members finally said, his voice tight, "after all these years." "We suspected he might resurface eventually," Edmund said grimly. "But not this soon, not with this level of organization." Cale's hands had curled into fists at his sides, though his expression remained carefully controlled. "When is the next scheduled celebration?" "The harvest gathering," another council member answered. 2 weeks from now. The entire pack will be present in the Great Hall." "Then that is when they intend to strike," Cale said quietly, the weight of the realization settling over the room like a heavy fog. One of the council members, a sharp-eyed woman Mira hadn't met before, turned her attention toward Mira with open suspicion. "How convenient that this information reaches us through someone whose loyalty this council has already questioned." "Elira," Cale said sharply, silencing her with a single word. Mira had every reason to remain silent tonight. She chose not to. That is not the behavior of someone working against us. "Or it's exactly the kind of misdirection someone clever enough would use," Elira pressed, though her tone carried more caution now that she had drawn the Alpha's sharp attention. "I understand your suspicion," Mira said, meeting the woman's gaze steadily, despite the tension coiling in her stomach. "But I have no reason to lie about this, and every reason to want this pack safe. I've spent weeks here, and whatever debt brought me to this territory, I no longer feel like a stranger passing through. I care what happens to this place." The room fell silent again, several council members exchanging uncertain glances. Finally Cale spoke, his voice carrying quiet finality. "We will proceed as though this threat is real, because the risk of ignoring it is far greater than the risk of preparing for something that may not come. Increase patrols along the northern border immediately. Quietly reinforce the Great Hall's defenses before the harvest gathering, and find out everything we can about Simon's movements over the past several months." The council members began discussing logistics immediately, the urgency of the moment pulling their attention away from Mira entirely. She stood quietly near the door, watching Cale take charge with the same calm authority she had witnessed the night she first arrived, though now she understood the depth of the weight he carried, far better than she had before. When the meeting finally concluded, and the council members filed out of the chamber, Cale remained behind, his eyes finding Mira's across the room. "Thank you," he said quietly, once they were alone, "for telling me, even knowing how it might look." "I couldn't stay silent," Mira admitted. "Not after everything I've seen since arriving here. This pack, it matters to me now, more than I expected it to." Cale studied her for a long moment, something soft and unguarded passing behind his eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Mira Voss. Is that a good thing?" she asked, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips despite the heaviness of the evening. "It is becoming one of the best things in my life," he said quietly, the honesty in his voice catching them both slightly off guard. Neither of them spoke further on the matter that night, the weight of the coming danger settling too heavily over the room to allow for anything more. But as Mira finally left the council chamber and made her way back toward her small room beneath a sky full of quiet, watching stars, she understood that everything had changed. The threat was real. The danger was coming. And somewhere in the middle of it all, she had become someone the Alpha King trusted with, more than just idle conversation by the fire. She only hoped that trust would be enough to help them survive whatever Simon and his followers were planning to unleash upon the pack she had slowly, quietly, come to think of as her own. The days following the council meeting passed in a blur of quiet urgency. Patrols doubled along the northern border, warriors moving through the tree line at all hours, their expressions grim with purpose. The Great Hall's defenses were reinforced under the guise of routine repairs, extra guards stationed near every entrance without drawing obvious attention from the wider pack. Cale moved through it all with steady, controlled focus, though Mira could see the toll it was taking on him in the deepening shadows beneath his eyes. It became a habit, without either of them fully acknowledging it, for Mira to join him during the late hours after the hall had emptied. She would bring him a cup of something warm, and he would gesture for her to sit, and they would talk quietly by the dying fire while the rest of the pack slept, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond their borders. "You don't have to stay up with me every night," Cale said one evening, though the words carried no real conviction, as if part of him hoped she would ignore them entirely. "I don't mind," Mira said, settling into the seat across from him, the same seat she had first occupied weeks earlier. "Besides, someone should make sure you actually rest, instead of staring at maps until sunrise." A tired smile touched his lips, the first genuine one she had seen from him in days. "Edmund says the same thing, though far less gently." "Edmund cares about you," Mira said. "As does the rest of this pack, even if they don't always show it well." Cale was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the fire. "It's strange, carrying the weight of so many lives depending on the choices I make, and yet feeling more at ease in this quiet hall with you than I do surrounded by the entire council." Mira felt warmth rise in her chest at his words, though she kept her expression calm, unwilling to let him see just how much they affected her. "Maybe because I don't need anything from you. I'm not asking you to be a king in these moments. Just yourself." "No one has offered me that in a very long time," he admitted quietly. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Finally, Cale spoke again, his voice lower, more hesitant than she had heard it before. "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone else in this pack?" "Of course," Mira said softly. He hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue, before finally speaking. "Simon wasn't simply a rival who left this pack under difficult circumstances. He was my father's most trusted advisor once, a mentor to me, in many ways, before everything changed. When my father passed, and I took on the role of Alpha earlier than anyone expected, Simon believed I was too young, too inexperienced to lead. He challenged my authority in front of the entire pack, and when the council sided with me instead of him, he left in anger, vowing that I would regret ever taking the title he believed should have gone to someone more capable." Mira absorbed this information carefully, understanding now the deeper layers of pain beneath the political threat the council had discussed. That must have been difficult, losing someone you trusted, especially so soon after losing your father. "It was," Cale admitted. "For a long time, I wondered if he was right, if I truly wasn't ready for this role. It's part of why I carry so much weight. Even now, years later, every decision feels like proof I need to offer, both to this pack and to the doubt Simon planted in me before he left." "You've led this pack well," Mira said firmly. "I've seen it with my own eyes, even in the short time I've been here. The way your people trust you, the way you protect even someone like me, who arrived here as nothing more than a stranger crossing your border by mistake. That isn't weakness, Cale, that's strength." He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded passing behind his golden eyes, an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "You have a way of making me believe that, even when the doubt feels loudest." "Maybe that's because it's true," Mira said gently. The space between them felt smaller in that moment than it ever had before, the quiet intimacy of the empty hall wrapping around them like a second fire, warmer than the one crackling nearby. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance, though Mira felt the pull of it settle deep in her chest, undeniable now in a way she could no longer pretend to ignore. "Mira," Cale said quietly, her name carrying a weight she hadn't heard from him before. "Whatever happens in the coming weeks, with Simon, with the harvest gathering, I want you to know that your presence here has become something I value more than I expected to, more than perhaps I should, given everything currently at stake." "I feel the same," Mira admitted softly. I came here as a debt to be paid. Somewhere along the way, that debt turned into something I care about protecting, just as much as you do. They sat together long after the fire had burned low. The quiet comfort between them, a small, fragile thing they both seemed reluctant to disturb. It wasn't declared aloud, not fully, not yet, but something had shifted between them in that firelight. A bond forged not through obligation or debt, but through genuine trust and understanding. That bond would be tested sooner than either of them expected. 2 nights later, a scout returned from the Northern Patrol with urgent news. Unfamiliar movement had been spotted near the border, small groups moving carefully through the tree line under cover of darkness. Simon's followers were closer than the council had anticipated, and the harvest gathering, still more than a week away, suddenly felt far too close for comfort. Cale called an emergency council meeting that night, his earlier warmth replaced once again by the sharp, focused authority of a king, preparing his pack for danger. Mira watched from the edge of the hall as warriors were assigned new patrol routes, as Edmund coordinated additional defenses, as the entire pack quietly shifted into a state of careful readiness. She didn't know, as she watched Cale move through the chaos with steady determination, just how close the coming danger truly was. She only knew, deep in her chest, that whatever happened in the days ahead, she would not simply stand by and watch from a distance. She had already decided, somewhere in the quiet nights spent by the fire, that this pack, and the king who led it, had become worth protecting with everything she had. The night of the harvest gathering arrived, with a golden sunset that stretched long shadows across the village, the great hall glowing with warm light, as pack members gathered from every corner of the territory to celebrate the season's end. Long tables overflowed with food, laughter, and music filled the air, and for a brief moment, watching the pack come together in genuine joy, Mira allowed herself to believe that perhaps the danger they had prepared for so carefully might never come at all. She should have known better than to hope. Extra guards had been stationed discreetly around the hall's perimeter, their presence disguised as part of the celebration rather than obvious defense. Cale moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting pack members, offering warm words to elders and children alike, playing the role of a king fully present for his people, even as Mira knew his senses remained sharp, alert to anything out of place. She found herself standing near the edge of the hall for most of the evening, watching the celebration unfold, her own senses equally alert despite her lack of a warrior's training. Grace found her there partway through the night, offering a warm cup of cider and a reassuring smile. "Try to enjoy yourself," Grace said gently. "The patrols are doubled, the guards are ready. Whatever happens, this pack is prepared." "I hope you're right," Mira said, though the knot of unease in her stomach refused to loosen. It was nearing midnight, the celebration beginning its slow wind down, when the first scream echoed from outside the hall. Everything happened at once. The doors burst open, and figures Mira had never seen before flooded into the hall, their movements sharp and coordinated, weapons already drawn. Panic erupted through the crowd as pack members scrambled, some rushing toward exits, others turning to fight, as warriors who had been stationed among the guests revealed themselves, meeting the intruders head-on. "Simon's followers," someone shouted, and the name sent a fresh wave of fear rippling through the hall. Mira's heart pounded as she was swept into the chaos, pushed and jostled by the fleeing crowd, her eyes desperately searching for Cale among the sea of panicked faces. She caught sight of him near the center of the hall, already engaged in fierce combat with 2 of the intruders, his movements sharp and controlled despite being outnumbered. "Cale!" she called out, though her voice was swallowed by the roar of the chaos surrounding them. A figure emerged from the crowd near the hall's entrance, older, with cold, calculating eyes, that swept across the room with the satisfaction of someone watching a long-planned scheme finally unfold. Mira didn't need anyone to tell her this was Simon. The resemblance to the description Cale had shared with her, and the dark authority radiating from him as his followers fought around him, made his identity unmistakable. "You should have stepped aside years ago," Simon called out, his voice carrying clearly over the chaos as he advanced toward Cale. "The pack was never truly yours to lead. This pack chose me," Cale shot back, deflecting a strike from one of the remaining attackers near him. "Just as it will continue to choose me over you." Simon's expression darkened, and he gestured sharply towards several of his followers stationed near the hall's support beams. Mira's stomach dropped as she watched them produce small vessels of oil, quickly splashing it across the ancient wooden beams and support structures of the hall. "If I cannot lead this pack," Simon said coldly, "then perhaps there will be nothing left for you to lead either." "No!" Mira's cry was lost in the chaos, as one of Simon's followers struck flint against the oil-soaked wood, and flames erupted with terrifying speed, catching along the dry timber and racing upward toward the hall's ancient wooden beams. Panic surged through the remaining crowd as the fire spread with alarming speed, smoke beginning to fill the upper reaches of the hall. Pack members who had been fighting moments before now scrambled toward exits, warriors pulling wounded companions to safety amid the growing chaos. Cale fought on, pushing back against the remaining attackers even as the flames grew higher around them, clearly refusing to abandon his pack while danger still lingered within the hall. Mira watched in horror as Simon, seeing his plan already in motion, began retreating toward the chaos near the entrance, his followers covering his escape as the fire continued to spread. "Get everyone out!" Cale's voice boomed across the hall, cutting through the panic with commanding authority as he directed fleeing pack members toward the safest exits, even while continuing to fend off the last of the attackers, still within striking distance. Mira found herself pulled toward an exit by the surging crowd, smoke stinging her eyes, the heat of the growing fire pressing against her skin. She fought against the flow of bodies, desperately trying to keep sight of Cale through the chaos, watching as he finally dispatched the last attacker near him before turning to help an elderly pack member trapped beneath a fallen bench. It was in that moment, as he bent to help the trapped elder, that one of Simon's retreating followers turned back, striking out with a final desperate blow before disappearing into the smoke and chaos beyond the hall's entrance. Mira watched, horror freezing her lungs, as Cale staggered, his hand rising briefly toward his side before his legs buckled beneath him, his body collapsing to the smoke-filled floor of the burning hall. "Cale?" The scream tore from her throat, raw and desperate, as she fought against the crowd surging around her, pushing her further from the hall even as every instinct in her body screamed to move toward him instead. The elderly pack member he had been helping was pulled to safety by nearby warriors, but in the chaos and thick smoke now filling the hall, no one else seemed to notice the king had fallen. The crowd continued surging toward the exits, warriors focused on directing the panicked evacuation, unaware that their alpha lay unconscious on the burning floor behind them. Mira's mind raced, every rational thought screaming at her to keep moving toward safety, to save herself while she still could. The smoke was growing thicker by the second, the flames climbing higher along the ancient wooden beams above, sections of the roof beginning to groan under the growing heat. But beneath the fear, beneath every instinct urging her toward the exit, a different, stronger pull took hold of her heart. She thought of every quiet conversation by the fire, every moment of genuine trust built between them over the past weeks, every glimpse of the man beneath the crown who had shown her more kindness than she had received in years. She could not leave him there. Whatever the cost, whatever danger waited within those flames, she could not simply walk away and let the fire claim the life of the man who had, without either of them fully realizing it, become the most important person in her world. Mira turned against the fleeing crowd, pushing her way back toward the heart of the burning hall, toward the fallen king no one else had noticed, disappearing into the smoke and flames, just as the ancient roof above began its first terrible groan of collapse. The heat hit Mira like a physical wall the moment she pushed deeper into the hall, smoke thick enough to sting her eyes and burn her throat with every desperate breath. She dropped low, remembering somewhere in the panic of her mind that clearer air lingered closer to the ground, and crawled forward through the chaos toward the spot where she had last seen Cale fall. "Cale," she called out, her voice raw against the roar of the flames now consuming the upper beams of the hall. Above her, the ancient wooden structure groaned and cracked, embers raining down like deadly snow, small fires beginning to catch along the fallen benches and scattered debris covering the floor. She nearly missed him in the thick smoke, his body partially hidden behind an overturned table, but a flash of firelight caught against his still form, and relief and terror crashed through her chest at once as she scrambled toward him. "Cale, please," she gasped, pressing trembling fingers against his neck, searching desperately for a pulse. For one horrifying second, she felt nothing beneath her fingers, but her own racing heartbeat. Then, faint but steady, she found it. His heart still beating, though his breathing had grown shallow and uneven from the smoke filling his lungs. Thank goodness, she breathed, relief mixing with fresh urgency, as she took in the extent of the space around them. The exit she had come through was now largely obscured by smoke and falling debris, and a section of the roof directly above them groaned ominously, threatening collapse at any moment. She had no warrior's strength, no shifter abilities to draw upon the way the rest of the pack could. She was simply a woman who had spent weeks scrubbing floors and hauling firewood, faced now with the impossible task of moving a man far larger than herself out of a burning building before it collapsed entirely. But impossible had never stopped her before, not when it mattered most. "Come on," she whispered, gripping beneath his arms and pulling with every ounce of strength she possessed. His weight was immense, and for one terrifying moment, she feared she wouldn't be able to move him at all. But slowly, inch by agonizing inch, she managed to drag him away from the overturned table, toward what she hoped was still a viable path to safety. Smoke burned her lungs with every breath, her eyes streaming from the heat and ash filling the air around them. She kept low, using the table and fallen benches as cover from the worst of the smoke, dragging Cale's unconscious form across the debris-covered floor with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. A loud crack echoed from above, and Mira looked up just in time to see a section of burning beam breaking free from the ceiling, crashing down mere feet from where they had been moments before. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she redoubled her efforts, pulling Cale faster now, adrenaline overriding the growing exhaustion in her arms and legs. "Stay with me," she gasped, though she wasn't certain if she was speaking to him or to herself. "We're almost there, just a little further." The main entrance was fully blocked now, flames and fallen debris, creating an impassable wall of danger. Mira's mind raced, desperately searching her memory of the hall's layout for any alternative path to safety. She remembered, suddenly, a smaller side door near the kitchen, one she had used dozens of times while carrying supplies during her weeks of service. Changing direction, she pulled Cale toward the back of the hall, away from the worst of the flames, her muscles screaming in protest with every step. The heat grew more intense the closer they drew to certain sections of the burning structure, forcing her to navigate carefully, avoiding patches of fire that had already claimed portions of the floor. Her lungs burned with every breath of smoke-filled air, her vision beginning to blur from exhaustion and the stinging heat surrounding them. But she refused to stop, refused to let go, even as her body begged her to abandon the effort and save herself while she still could. "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely, more to herself than to the unconscious man she continued to drag across the debris-strewn floor. "Not after everything. Not now." The kitchen door finally came into view through the thick smoke, and Mira felt a fresh surge of desperate hope propel her forward. She pulled Cale the final few feet toward the door, her arms shaking with exhausted effort, and shoved it open with the last of her remaining strength. Cool night air rushed against her face, a stark and blessed contrast to the suffocating heat behind them. She dragged Cale through the doorway, out into the open space behind the hall, collapsing to her knees beside him as her body finally gave out from the exertion. Behind them, the great hall's roof gave a final, terrible groan before collapsing inward with a deafening crash, flames shooting high into the night sky, sparks scattering across the darkness like a violent, terrible display. Mira stared at the destruction, her chest heaving, her entire body trembling from exhaustion and shock, hardly able to believe they had made it out mere moments before the structure fully collapsed. "Cale," she gasped, turning her attention back to him, checking desperately for any sign of consciousness. His chest rose and fell steadily now, the fresh air seeming to ease the shallow breathing that had worried her so deeply inside the hall, but his eyes remained closed, his body still unresponsive to her frantic calls. "Someone, please," Mira screamed toward the chaos still unfolding around the front of the collapsed hall, her voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. "I need help. The Alpha is hurt." It took only moments for warriors to respond to her cries, several pack members rushing around the side of the burning structure, their expressions shifting from shock to urgent action the moment they spotted their fallen king. Edmund arrived moments later, his face pale with horror, as he took in the scene before him. "What happened?" he demanded, kneeling beside Kale, and checking his condition with practiced urgency. He was struck down inside, Mira managed between exhausted breaths. I couldn't leave him there. I had to bring him out. Edmund's eyes widened as understanding settled over him, his gaze shifting between the collapsed hall behind them and the exhausted woman who had somehow managed to drag their alpha to safety before the structure fully fell. You went back inside, alone? I couldn't leave him, Mira repeated, her voice breaking slightly, with the release of adrenaline finally beginning to fade. I couldn't just let him die in there. Warriors quickly moved to carefully lift Kale, carrying him toward the pack's healer with careful urgency, Edmund following closely behind, while directing others to continue the search for any remaining survivors near the wreckage. Mira remained kneeling in the grass, her body trembling with exhaustion, watching as they carried the unconscious king away, uncertain if her desperate efforts inside the burning hall would ultimately be enough to save him. The night sky above continued to glow with the dying flames of the collapsed hall, smoke rising in thick columns against the stars, the celebration that had begun the evening in joy, now ending in devastation and uncertainty. Mira sat alone in the aftermath, exhausted beyond words, praying silently that the man she had risked everything to save would survive the night that had so nearly claimed them both. The days following the fire passed in a haze of smoke-scented recovery for the entire pack. What remained of the Great Hall stood as a blackened, skeletal reminder of the attack, though the warriors and elders had already begun discussing plans for rebuilding before the ashes had even fully cooled. The pack had lost their hall, but remarkably, thanks to the quick evacuation and Kale's efforts before his fall, they had lost very few lives that terrible night. Kale himself remained unconscious for 3 long days following the fire, the smoke inhalation, and the wound he had suffered leaving him in a fragile state that worried even the most experienced healers within the pack. Mira barely left his side during those days. Exhaustion and worry etched deeply into her features as she kept vigil beside the bed where he had been carefully placed, refusing every suggestion from Edmund or Grace that she rest. You saved his life, Grace said gently on the second day, setting a tray of food beside Mira that had gone largely untouched. The least you can do now is take care of yourself while he recovers. I can't leave, Mira said quietly, her eyes never straying from Kale's still form. Not until I know he's going to be all right. Edmund, who had taken to checking on both of them regularly throughout the ordeal, finally sat down across from her on the 3rd day, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. The healers believe the worst has passed. His breathing has strengthened, and the wound is healing well, thanks to your quick action in getting him out before the smoke could do further damage. I was terrified I wouldn't make it out in time, Mira admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. That I would lose him before I ever had the chance to. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Before you had the chance to what? Edmund asked gently. Mira shook her head, embarrassed by the vulnerability threatening to spill over. It doesn't matter now. He's going to be all right. That's what matters. Edmund studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice carrying a warmth she hadn't expected from him. The entire pack has heard what you did that night. Going back into a burning hall, alone, to save a king everyone else believed had already made it to safety. There are many who once viewed you with suspicion, Mira, who now speak your name with nothing but respect and gratitude. Mira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, exhaustion and emotion finally beginning to overwhelm the careful control she had maintained for 3 long days. I didn't do it for gratitude. I did it because I couldn't imagine losing him. I know, Edmund said softly. That is precisely why the pack respects you now. Not because of grand gestures made for recognition, but because your actions came from something far more genuine. It was later that same evening, as the sun began to set and Mira sat once again beside Kale's bed, that she finally noticed the faint stirring of movement beneath his closed eyes. Her heart leapt into her throat as she leaned forward, watching anxiously as his eyelids fluttered, slowly opening to reveal the golden eyes she had feared she might never see again. Kale, she breathed, relief and joy crashing through her chest with such force that tears finally spilled freely down her cheeks. He blinked slowly, disoriented for a long moment, before his gaze focused on her face, recognition slowly dawning despite his obvious exhaustion. Mira, he rasped, his voice rough from days of disuse and smoke exposure. What happened? The hall. It's gone, Mira said gently, taking his hand carefully in hers. But the pack survived. Most everyone made it out safely. You saved a great many lives that night, even before you fell. Cale's brow furrowed as fragmented memories seemed to return to him slowly. Simon. The fire. I remember being struck down, and then… He trailed off, studying her face carefully. How did I get out? Mira hesitated, suddenly unsure how to explain what she had done, without it sounding like more than she intended it to be. I couldn't leave you there. When I saw you fall, and no one else seemed to notice in the chaos, I went back for you. His eyes widened, understanding slowly dawning, as he processed her words. You went back into the fire? Alone? I didn't think about it. Not really, Mira admitted. I only knew I couldn't let the flames take you while I did nothing to stop it. Cale stared at her for a long moment, an expression crossing his face that Mira had never seen from him before. Something raw and overwhelmed, and deeply grateful all at once. You could have died in there. I know, Mira said simply. I chose to risk it anyway. He was quiet for a long moment, his hand tightening gently around hers, before he finally spoke again, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. 3 weeks ago, you arrived in this territory as a stranger who owed this pack a debt for trespassing on land you didn't even know existed. Now I owe you a debt far greater than anything I could ever hope to repay. You saved my life, Mira, at great risk to your own. You don't owe me anything, Mira said softly. I didn't do it because I expected something in return. I know that, Cale said, his voice gentle but firm. Which is precisely why what I feel for you has become something far deeper than simple gratitude. He studied her carefully, vulnerability clear in his tired eyes. I have spent weeks trying to convince myself that what I feel toward you is nothing more than appreciation for your character, your kindness toward this pack, despite everything. But sitting here now, having nearly lost the chance to ever say this to you, I can no longer pretend it is anything less than what it truly is. Mira's breath caught in her throat, hardly daring to hope for the words she sensed were coming. I care for you, Mira, deeply, and far beyond what a king should reasonably feel for someone who arrived in his territory as nothing more than a trespasser, Cale continued, his voice steady, despite the raw honesty behind his words. You have shown me more genuine loyalty and courage in these past weeks than I have witnessed from pack members who have known me their entire lives, and I very nearly lost the chance to tell you any of this. Tears continued to fall freely down Mira's cheeks, though now they carried far more joy than grief. I care for you too, Cale, more than I ever expected to, when I first arrived here as a frightened stranger, facing a debt I didn't understand. He reached up carefully, brushing a gentle thumb across her cheek to wipe away her tears, his touch tender, despite his weakened state. Then let this be the moment the debt between us is finally settled, once and for all, not through years of labor or service, but through the truth of what has grown between us since the night you first arrived. Mira leaned into his touch, warmth spreading through her chest, despite the exhaustion of the past several days. I would like that very much. Outside the small healing quarters, the pack continued its slow process of rebuilding, the ashes of the Great Hall, giving way to careful plans for a new structure that would rise stronger than before. But within that quiet room, as Cale and Mira sat together in the fading evening light, something far more important than any building had already begun to rebuild itself. A bond forged through fire and near loss, stronger now than either of them had ever imagined it could become. 2 months passed before the new Great Hall stood complete, its timber fresh and pale against the surrounding forest, its foundation built deliberately stronger than the one that had fallen to Simon's flames. The entire pack had contributed to its construction, warriors and elders, and even the youngest pack members carrying stones and timber. Each contribution a quiet act of defiance against the destruction that had nearly claimed everything they held dear. Cale's recovery had been steady in the weeks following the fire, his strength returning gradually under the careful watch of the pack healers, though Mira suspected his fastest progress came during the evenings they spent together, walking slowly through the rebuilding village as his body regained its former vitality. Simon's followers had scattered in the aftermath of their failed attack, and though the council remained cautious, extended patrols confirming no immediate threat of another assault, A quiet sense of security had begun settling back over the pack. The suspicion that had once followed Mira through the village had transformed entirely into something closer to reverence. Pack members who had once eyed her with distrust now greeted her warmly wherever she went, some even seeking her out, simply to thank her again for the courage she had shown that terrible night. Gareth, of all people, had approached her during the hall's construction, his earlier hostility replaced with genuine humility. "I owe you an apology," he had said, unable to fully meet her eyes. "The way I treated you, the things I said. You've proven yourself more loyal to this pack than I ever gave you credit for." "Thank you for saying that," Mira had replied simply. And though the words hadn't erased the memory of his earlier cruelty entirely, she found she held no lingering resentment toward him. The pack had changed its view of her, and more importantly, she had changed her own understanding of what this territory, and the people within it, truly meant to her. Illyra, too, had softened considerably, her sharp suspicion during the council meeting replaced with quiet respect whenever Mira's name came up in discussions. The council itself had unanimously agreed, without any pressure from Kale, that whatever debt Mira had originally owed the pack had been paid in full many times over the moment she carried their alpha out of the burning hall. It was on the evening the new hall was finally completed, its first fire lit within the freshly built hearth, that Kale called the entire pack together, for a gathering unlike any they had held before. Mira stood near the back of the crowd initially, watching with quiet pride, as Kale addressed his people from the center of the newly finished hall, his voice carrying the same steady authority she had first witnessed the night she arrived as a frightened trespasser months earlier. "Tonight we celebrate more than simply the completion of this hall," Kale said, his gaze sweeping across the gathered pack with genuine warmth. "We celebrate the resilience of this pack, the loyalty that carried us through our darkest night, and the courage of those who refused to let fear determine their actions when it mattered most." He paused, his eyes finding Mira's across the crowded hall, and gestured for her to join him at the front. Surprised murmurs rippled through the gathering as Mira made her way forward, uncertain what he intended, but trusting him completely, as she stepped up beside him. "Many of you remember the night this woman arrived in our territory," Kale continued, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "A trespasser, by our laws, owing a debt for crossing into land that was not hers. Some of you questioned her loyalty. Some of you doubted her intentions. I understand that caution, given everything our pack has faced." He turned to look at Mira directly, his expression softening with a warmth that made her breath catch despite the crowd surrounding them. "But this woman has proven, time and again, that her loyalty to this pack surpasses that of many who were born within these borders. She warned us of Simon's plans when silence would have been easier. She carried me from a burning hall when every instinct should have told her to save herself instead." He reached for her hand, holding it gently before the entire gathered pack, his eyes never leaving hers. "Whatever debt she once owed this pack has been repaid many times over. Tonight, I release her from that obligation entirely, not as a dismissal, but as an acknowledgement of everything she has given this pack freely, without ever expecting anything in return." A wave of warm applause moved through the hall, pack members nodding and smiling toward Mira with genuine affection, but Kale wasn't finished. He turned fully toward her now, lowering himself slowly to one knee before the entire assembled pack, and Mira felt her heart stop entirely as understanding dawned on what was about to happen. "Mira Voss," Kale said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability clear in his eyes. "You arrived in this territory as a stranger, and became, in the span of a few short months, the most important person in my life. You showed this pack, and showed me, what true loyalty looks like when it is given freely, without obligation or expectation. I do not simply wish to release you from a debt tonight. I wish to ask you to stay, not as someone bound by circumstance, but as someone who chooses this pack, and chooses me, freely and completely." He paused, and Mira felt tears gathering in her eyes, as the entire hall held its breath alongside her. "Will you stay by my side, Mira, not as a servant paying off a debt, but as my equal, my mate, and the future Luna of this pack?" The hall erupted in warm, joyful noise even before Mira could answer, though her response, when it finally came through tears of overwhelming happiness, needed no amplification to be heard by everyone present. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion as Kale rose to his feet, pulling her gently into an embrace, that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. I choose this pack. I choose you. I have, I think, since the very first night you spared my life, instead of turning me away. The celebration that followed lasted long into the night, the new hall filled with music and laughter and genuine joy, a stark and healing contrast to the devastation that had claimed its predecessor months earlier. Mira moved through the crowd, surrounded by well wishes and warm embraces from pack members, who had once viewed her as nothing more than an unwelcome trespasser, now embracing her as their future Luna with open hearts and genuine affection. Later that evening, as the celebration began winding down and the fire in the new hearth burned steady and warm, Kale found Mira standing near the same spot where they had first spoken all those months ago, watching the flames with a peaceful smile on her face. "Regrets?" he asked softly, settling beside her. "None," Mira said, leaning into him comfortably. "I once thought a debt to this pack was the worst thing that could have happened to me. Now I understand it was simply the beginning of everything good that was still waiting for me." Kale pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, the weight he had carried for so long finally, truly lifted from his shoulders. "Then let us begin this new chapter together, exactly as it was always meant to be." Outside the new great hall, the village continued its quiet, peaceful rhythm, beneath a sky full of stars. The pack finally at rest, after months of fear and uncertainty. And within those newly built walls, a bond forged through fire, loyalty, and genuine love stood as strong and unshakable as the fresh timber holding the hall together, ready to carry both the pack and the two people now leading it into whatever future awaited them, together, always.